Kia ora and welcome to this episode of Shared Lunch, where we're going to be looking at all things home ownership and housing in Aotearoa. We're lucky enough to be joined by the Minister of Housing, Chris Bishop. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I mentioned to you just before we got started that a huge number of the people investing on the Sharesies platform are investing still for the purpose of home ownership. Like, it's still a massive story of New Zealanders, and it is starting to, we also know that it's feeling more and more out of reach for them. So there's lots around that. But we thought a great way to start the conversation would be just to ask you how, do you own a home and what your path to home ownership was?
I do. I'm very lucky. My wife and I own a house, and really conscious that that's not the experience for many people, my age and a bit below. I've just turned 40, so I like probably a lot of New Zealanders. Went to university, lived at home for a few years, and then went flatting. Rented in both Wellington and Auckland for a number of years. Bought an apartment. That was my sort of entry point. House prices were a lot lower back in 2012. So an apartment was an affordable way to get on the housing ladder. And then moved back to Wellington, ran for Parliament and, bought a house, and now we own another one. So we just own one house, I should say. So, like many people, went from one house to another. Yep. With a very, very large mortgage. That's sort of my journey. Very conscious that that's not the experience for many people. And part of my big drive in housing as Minister of Housing is to make home ownership more affordable for people my age and below, and in fact all New Zealanders. I want many more people to have the opportunities that I and other people in my very fortunate position have been able to enjoy. Yeah, great.
I also hit a very lucky point in the housing market. Well, I think I was about 2015 or 2016, I think, which I think was the end of like a 10-year flat part for the property market, but it still felt like I was,
like a lot of people, back mum and dad helped.
Right. Yeah.
So, getting that deposit together for the apartment, back in 2012 was, was a real stretch. And so, bank mum and dad came to the party with a, interest-free loan, and, and that's the experience for a lot of young people. And we're going to try and change that because, people should see housing as something that they can get into and be able to pull together a deposit.
Yeah, mine was Kiwisaver, which was sort of the saving grace to get there.
Yeah, that was part of it as well.
Yeah. You touched on the prices and the change and the affordability, but you're one of the few, if not the only, certainly in this position, to say that house prices need to come down. And that's a big call, I think, for any politician. But what drove you to that point, and can you specify how much, or do you have an idea on how much they should decrease by?
Yeah, people sort of got quite worked up saying, the housing minister wants house prices to fall, but it's the natural corollary of saying that housing is unaffordable, which it demonstrably is and objectively is the case. So if, as some politicians say, you think housing's unaffordable, but you don't want prices to fall, well, they're sort of hollow words, right? Because if something's unaffordable, you want it to be more affordable, and more affordable means you've got to have, house prices have got to come down. And there's obviously two ways to make housing more affordable. One is price declines, and then income growth, and the truth is we need both. So we need a much more productive economy with rising wages, where wages rise faster than inflation, and where wages rise faster than house price growth, so that people can catch up. But also, at the house price level, you need them to come down, and over time we want to that's the driving force of the government, is to make housing more affordable. So to answer your question around what and where, a good measure of an affordable housing market is where house prices are, between 3 and 5 times average household income. That's not the case at the moment. Queenstown is an outlier example, but it's 11 to 1. Auckland is about 9 to 1. Average is about 7.5 to 8 to 1 in New Zealand. The numbers bounce around a bit, and depending on what measure you use. But by any objective measure, New Zealand house prices are severely unaffordable. And over the last 20 years, we have had the fastest house price growth in the OECD, in the Western world. And you just look at New Zealand and you say, we're 5 million people, not that many. We've got a landmass the size of the United Kingdom. Yeah. So pretty big country, actually, relative to our population. Mm-hmm. But we have designed a planning system and a funding system for infrastructure that makes house prices out of control. And it's nuts. and that's the driving force of our housing policy, is rather than tinker around the edges with things that kind of feel good but don't actually do a lot. The driving force of our housing policy is to get to grips with the underlying fundamentals, which is about land supply, infrastructure funding, and incentives on councils to make sure that they see housing as a benefit rather than a burden, which is what they do too much so at the moment.
Yeah, there's so many questions out of what you've just said there, but just interested out of that, what your thoughts are on home ownership in New Zealand. Like you've already touched on, you believe people should be able to own their own home. So maybe more about as an investment vehicle versus productive assets that are more likely to grow incomes and things.
Yeah, I mean, home ownership in New Zealand's down to 63%, so it's at record lows. So we want to improve that. We want New Zealand to be a property owning democracy where people can get a foot on the ladder. It's an issue of intergenerational equity. People my age and younger. I used to be a young MP. I think 40. I'm no longer a young MP. I'm sort of middle aged as an MP. But people my age and below, they look at a housing market and it's unaffordable, as you know, and as many of the listeners will know. So we want to change that, and there are lots of reasons for that. There's an equity issue around, particularly a generational issue. There's also a ginormous fiscal cost to government out of the housing market. So we spend as a government $5 billion a year on housing subsidies across accommodation supplement, income-related rents, emergency housing, the whole range of other housing products. It's a ginormous fiscal cost for government. And of course, all of that money is money that we can't spend on the police, on the health system, on the education system, things like that, because the housing market's dysfunctional. So government money just ends up chasing the housing market and filling in the blanks and trying to fix up regulatory errors that have been made through the planning system and the infrastructure funding system. So it's a ginormous dislocative effect for government. And then there are just the productivity benefits of more housing. So what's really clear is cities that grow are engines of productivity and engines of economic growth. And that's the big thing New Zealand needs. We need more productivity and we need economic growth. One of the things I constantly say, and I'm on a bit of a persuasion campaign around, in public life, is to persuade people one of the single best things we can do to get the economy going and get productivity up in New Zealand is to fix our housing market. And part of that goes to your point, which is making sure that people don't just see the housing market as this giant vehicle for capital gains where they can just shovel as much money into the housing market as possible, into second properties and third properties, and see massive capital gains and sit on those. But, investing in productive New Zealand businesses, in the real economy rather than the housing market economy. Yeah. And so, again, fixing the underlying fundamentals of the housing market will rebalance the economy. And so there's multiple reasons to solve housing, and we're very fixated on it.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote, isn't it? The housing market with the bits tacked on.
Oh, I think it might have been Jacinda who said that. You won't hear me say this very often, but it's not the world's most unfair comment.
Right. Yeah. I'm interested to see what this sort of market dynamic with interest rates changing very quickly in another direction after a very long bullish run, buoyed by lots of reasons, which could continue. But I still really, really am passionate about people being able to invest in their own home, buy their own home. And I also think it's an amazing creator of wealth for people over time in a generational aspect for all sorts of communities. But probably more than anything for people who are making money out of housing is New Zealand has very low default rates on mortgages and home loans. So it's just like this compulsory savings plan over and over again, which sort of leads me into my next question, which is thinking about how this you sort of mentioned the economy around this, how it's gone decades as far as a problem, the housing aspect in New Zealand. Do you think there's any way we could look at this in any sort of single mandate mindset where we can see continuation over a longer than a sort of parliamentary term type investment? Like the example I've read by some commentators is the Reserve Bank coming in to control inflation. Or is there any way that you can see us really working together in a bipartisan manner to achieve these outcomes?
Yeah, I think the prospect of that is actually quite good. So the thrust of our housing policy picks up on the best of what Labor did. So Phil Twyford and the last government back in 1920 passed a thing called the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which is the thing that allows for, or essentially mandates councils to upzone around train stations and city centres, so allow more apartments, bigger buildings in city centres, metropolitan city centres, and around train stations. That, by the way, has had world acclaim and is in the process of being implemented in Christchurch, Auckland, Wellington, and other cities. So our housing policy picks up on that and doubles down on that in a way. So we've announced a package, which we haven't implemented yet, but announced a package where we will go further. So more mixed-use zoning, for example, which is essentially a zoning term for more cafes and supermarkets and boutiques and bodegas and things like that in and around apartments and places where people want to live. So the way planners view cities is, you live here and you work over here in the commercial area, and then, you've got your industrial area over here, and then you go shopping on the weekend or at night over here, and, never the twain shall meet. Actually, it's not the way people live their lives. It's not the way people want to live their lives. And so mixed-use zoning is about liberalising our planning laws to allow people to do more with their own property and create more livable cities. So we're going to make sure that we're going to mandate that in our major cities. We're going to get rid of minimum apartment sizes in our cities, which again is a liberalising effect to mean that people who want to build apartments of a certain size can do so. We're going to get rid of minimum balcony requirements, for example. Balcony requirements, there's a study out a few years ago. Balcony requirements add $50,000 to $70,000 to the cost of an apartment in Auckland. So it has, if you want to have a balcony, that's fine, but they shouldn't be mandatory. I've got a whole piece of work I'm about to kick off around urban design, for example, because one of the issues is that councils impose largely subjective design requirements on housing, and they're not aware of the economic effects of doing those mandatory. Well, they're not mandatory, but they become mandatory because what happens is the council planner says, "Oh, it'd be good if you could do this to the property, or good if you could do that," and the developer, or whoever's building the house, essentially has to do it, otherwise the resource consent doesn't happen, or it happens a lot more slowly. So, to give you an example, a classic example that I got told about a few weeks ago. There's a social housing developer in Napier who's building social housing, so not particularly ornate, just affordable housing for low-income people. The council said, "Oh, we want you to put a Juliet balcony on all of the apartments." Well, Juliet balconies are those, I think they're named after Romeo and Juliet, like, small little balconies. Well, look, do they look great? Yeah, well, probably they do. But, that's massively raised the cost of putting the apartments in, and it means the social housing developer can do fewer apartments. So that's nuts. Apartments in Napier don't need Juliet balconies. And you shouldn't have to put one in to get a resource consent. So this is the thing that I think we're trying to grapple with when it comes to councils is every time you impose a requirement to do a particular thing when it comes to a new house, that imposes cost. And we are not in a position in New Zealand where we can just impose unnecessary, needless costs on housing. So we're going to get to grips with all of that. So anyway, to go back to where you started, which is bipartisanship. We've picked up what Labor did and done further. We've also picked up on the major thrust of where Phil Twyford was going around land use change generally. So I want the ability for cities to grow both up in city centres and major suburban hubs, but also out at the city fringe as well. And again, Phil Twyford started a bit of that stuff, and he got replaced as housing minister, and the kind of work ceased. So we're picking that up again. Whether or not Labor, the current iteration of the Labor Party, kind of supports that is kind of over to them. But certainly, I think the direction of travel is clear, which is that deregulating the housing market and liberalising planning restrictions and planning laws and sorting out the infrastructure system is the answer. There's a study out by Ryan McGreevy in University of Auckland that shows that the Auckland Unitary Plan, which has kind of started all of the stuff we've just been talking about back in 2016, rents in Auckland are appreciably lower as a result of the building boom caused by the Auckland Unitary Plan. So when you allow people to build and you actually give them the regulatory conditions where they can do it, they go and do it. and developers, get involved, and you get a housing boom. But we need more of it, and we need year after year of sustained house building and apartments and terraces and duplexes and
covered
all
about
of
my
the
next
above.
covered about my next 3 questions.
Oh,
That
right,
are response,
sorry.
which is no, don't be sorry. That's fantastic. We are seeing a lot about the social housing and media and things, and obviously there's a real big need for that. But we're the Sharesies customer base tends to be more focused on the people who are feeling locked out of the buying of the house, and some of the comments coming through from them are sort of those tools are disappearing for them. And like, what would your sort of response be to that with regards to what's happening from government specifically into supporting people into?
Yeah, so look, we got rid of the first home grant. So the first home grant was actually introduced by the last national government and continued by Labor. That provided for up to $10,000 for the purchase of a new house. The average grant was 5, but you could get up to 10. We got rid of it because it was a very expensive form of housing support, and it didn't really make a difference. And there are probably people out there watching who say, well, I'd like $5,000 or $10,000 towards a deposit, and I don't blame them. Who wouldn't? But on average, it brought forward the purchase of a property by about 6 months. So it didn't actually make the difference between people buying a property or being able to afford a property or not. It's just a bit of free money to help along the way. And we've got fiscally constrained times. It's a demand side measure as well. So it actually, on the margins, economically, it pushes prices up. So it actually works counter to what you're trying to do, which is achieve greater supply to lower prices over time. So we got rid of that, and we put it into social housing provision, because our view is when the wait list is 20,000 strong for social housing and you've got people living in emergency housing, it's a better use of Crown resource to fund social housing. So we did that. That was quite a tough call. Not everyone agreed with it, and I can appreciate that people don't necessarily like that. There's lots of things you can do, and lots of different sort of solutions, potential solutions. I just come back to the fundamental point, which is driving down land price, driving down the cost to build, freeing up planning restrictions, making it easier to build over time will reduce the cost of housing. Auckland Unitary Plan is an example where that is taking effect. But over time, I'm really confident the economic evidence is on our side that we are doing the right thing. Social housing, we've got a whole piece of work to get Kainga Ora, which is the government-owned housing corporation, focused on its costs.
It makes complete sense, right? That if you can buy a house for $20,000 or $30,000 less or more, it's better than receiving a grant. So if that can be achieved, I think that would be a fantastic outcome.
Yeah, there's a range of things we're looking at, like progressive home ownership and what's called shared equity.
Mm-hmm.
The current government, the last government, set up a whole range of different programs there. We're having a good look at those. They are quite expensive, and they're not at scale. So we're having a look at them and seeing what ones work and what ones don't. So not closing the door on those kind of options, but. Yeah, the absolute fundamental thrust is to sort out the planning system.
On the other side, we've got Kiwisaver. Any thoughts on how that could be used in any way with regards to accelerating that process to homeowning?
Yeah, so we've preserved the ability to do that. We got rid of the first home grant, but we preserved the ability for people to use Kiwisaver to withdraw, and not intending to change that. I saved a bunch of money in my own Kiwisaver back in the day and withdrew it, all of it basically, and wanted to get into my first home. So we've got an open mind in relation to that. Kiwisaver is a really important savings vehicle for a lot of New Zealanders and really growing strongly. So don't have any fixed policy in relation to changes there, but an open mind as to what we can do.
Final question, because we've got a bunch of investors, and whilst I've touched on before that I do not see myself as a retail investor into residential property going forward, like I do like the idea of investing into funds and that type of thing, and we have spoken before about the idea of a housing fund to help people into first homes and stuff from Sharesies, but the economics are hard to make that stack up. You sort of have this, basically where we find the gap is between the deposit need, which effectively most residential incomes cover your mortgage, which is normally 60-ish% of whatever that residential property is, hence the maths work, as soon as you add that 40%. So you've touched on the shared equity, the shared equity and those types of things going forward, but interested in how you see the likes of retail investors or shareholders and stuff, and Kiwisaver members, their part to play or any part in your plans going forward.
Yeah, I mean we're sort of got an open mind on all that stuff, and I'm interested in any ideas to do that. So we've got a very open mind to some of these things, and once you sort of step back a bit and say, we can create different vehicles or look at regulatory change in order to make those easier. We're up for those discussions. Very, very keen to talk about it. We've just got to get housing under control in New Zealand. It's very important for a whole generation or two of young New Zealanders, and it's very important for the wider economy, which would be my take-home point.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for your time.
All good. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
So thanks so much again to the Minister for joining us, and thanks everyone for tuning in. You can watch Shared Lunch on YouTube or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a rating and a comment about what you'd like to hear about next. Ka kite anō.